It literally was like stumbling across, like a medical mystery. Like, these kids had some of the worst health outcomes of, any neighborhood in the city. And then when I was caring for my patients, what I noticed was that the kids who had parents who were struggling with mental health conditions or substance dependence, they had worse health. The kids that were witnessing violence at home, they had worse health. The kids who were, had a parent who was incarcerated, and I was like, after a while, I'm just like, wait a minute. I wonder if these things are connected.
Dr. Harris, thank you so much for joining the Rebirth Podcast. How are you doing?
I am doing really well. Thank you.
That's awesome. There's so much that I want to unpack with you. There's so many layers and so many things that I want to be able to, discover about your work, your line of work, the things that you and your team are very passionate about. But I'm curious, and what I want to specifically discuss is this term ACEs and toxic stress, which I know for the listener, they're like, wait, what is this? And we're going to unpack that shortly, so be patient. But what I'm really curious is that, what sort of prompted you to get into this space and to paying attention to this line of work? Because I know you yourself, in regards to ACEs, it's a lot about the childhood trauma that we're exposed to that still lives with us. Was that something that factored into your decision to get into this space as well?
For sure not. Let me just tell you, I actually, this was not my intention at all. And when I went through, medical school and residency, so we do all this training. So one of the things that's really just weird about me that I noticed as I was doing my medical training was that when a crisis is happening, right? So when things are just, if a patient is coding or, cardiac arrest or something like that, I am really good. I'm really focused. I'm really calm. And I respond to stressful situations like really, really well. So
like you're calm in those moments when everyone else is probably trying to process what's going on.
Incredibly clear-headed. Yes. Very, very clear-headed.
Wow.
And the other thing that I noticed when I was doing my training was that when I did pediatrics, I would be in the hospital with these kids and they're just so delicious and so sweet. And I noticed that at the end of all of my other rotations, at the end of the day, I'd be exhausted. And when I did pediatrics, I'd be leaving the hospital after a 30 or a 36-hour shift. And if someone had said, hey, Nadine, we need you to go back in, I would be like, okay. Like, I just loved working with kids that much. So that's a little bit of a backstory on me in terms of how I'm wired, but so that's why I went into pediatrics, but I did not at all think that I would be addressing childhood trauma. In fact, when I came out of residency, I did my residency training at Stanford. And when I finished and I came to work in San Francisco, the one thing I did know, which has always been the case for me, was that I was really called to care for people who are vulnerable. Right. And so that's when I finished my training, I went to work in this neighborhood in San Francisco called Bayview Hunters Point, where literally there was only one pediatrician to care for more than 10,000 kids. And I was just like, this is not right. Like, and I have to say, I don't know if you have this feeling, but certainly for me as a woman of color, right? Like, you notice a lot of the times, for me, I certainly, the neighborhood that I started my clinic in was a neighborhood that was predominantly Black and brown. So, African-American, Latino, and Pacific Islander. And I was just like, how is it possible that San Francisco has one of the highest physician per capita ratios in the United States, and yet this neighborhood don't have a doctor? Like, how did that happen?
Wow.
Right?
Yeah,
So,
that is wild when you sit down and think about that. That is wild. How does that happen?
oh my goodness, for like that could be a whole nother podcast, but it really has to do with how we value, right? Like how so much of healthcare, it's what we pay for, and the payments that doctors get to care for, um, you know, people who are low income is
Right,
really low, right? And so
right.
that was a huge, so that was what called me to go work in Hunters Point. And then when I was there, the other thing about me is that I'm a super, super hardcore science nerd, right? Like my dad is a biochemist, so I think it's just in my DNA, but I love science, and I obviously studied public health. And when I was there, it literally was like stumbling across, like a medical mystery. Like these kids had some of the worst health outcomes of, any neighborhood in the city. And then when I was caring for my patients, what I noticed was that the kids who had parents who were struggling with mental health conditions or substance dependence, they had worse health. The kids that were witnessing violence at home, they had worse health. The
Mm,
kids who were, had a parent who was incarcerated, and I was like, after a while, I'm just like, wait a minute. I wonder if these things are connected. And
mm.
so I started to, like, I started just reading all of the research about how stress and trauma in childhood can affect our health. And that's when I came across the adverse childhood experiences study, because and what was crazy was that I didn't learn about this research when I was in medical school. I didn't learn about it when I was in residency. But when I was seeing my patients and trying to figure out, okay, how do I figure out what's really going on here? Is what they're witnessing, affecting their asthma or their diabetes, right? And doing
Right,
that
right.
research, that's when I found that CDC study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And that was a huge study that had been published in 1998, right? Like that's a
Wow.
long
So
time
this is
ago.
not brand new. This isn't new information. This is information that has been around. But I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth. And again, forgive me if I'm pressing a little bit, but it makes me feel, there's no financial gain, um, for a lot of physicians to kind of work in this space, right? Like it's almost like it makes me think of, being a veteran. You hear frequently that a lot of physicians will, yes, they'll do a rotation, they'll go to the VA, they'll spend some time there, get some training, but then there's more opportunity, there's more benefits, there's more money in the private sector, and so they pivot and go there. And not to say that, the VA is now getting individuals that aren't trained or aren't prepared or aren't willing to be there and to help, veterans, but it's you're not able to sort of compete with the rest of the market and say, hey, we want to retain a lot of you that may understand this space, that want to be in this space, that want to give back to this space. What is your, and I mean, considering that this study has been around for over 20 years, I mean, what is your reasoning that you've done your research? And I'm sure I've spoken to countless amount of people. What is your thoughts in regards to why this isn't something that is discussed more often?
So, okay, so a couple of things. The first thing I want to say, in terms of doctors practicing in low income areas, the um I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, because you have to, I mean, just realistically, it costs, like, people take out so much loans to be a doctor, right? So by the time you get there, it's
Right.
like, okay, you need to pay back your loans. The only way that I was able to do it was I got a scholarship for medical school, that was paid by for the, Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship. That meant that I didn't have, $100,000 worth of loans. So that was really important in my journey. And that really allowed me to go and practice in a place that was where my heart led me instead of where I had to go deal with loans. So that was a really big issue. And that's what allowed me to be able to, serve these families, come and work in this community, and then ultimately identify ACEs as this big problem. And a lot of people have asked me this question of why don't we talk about it more? Why don't we talk about childhood adversity more? Why don't we talk about the impacts of adverse childhood experiences on health? And I will say there are so many reasons, but probably the biggest one is that I think that people are afraid, right? I think that people they're worried that if we start talking about it, it'll be like, you ever heard of Pandora's box, right? Like no one wants to take the lid off because then you can't, all the stuff is going to come out and you won't be able to stuff it back in, right? I think that is, I think that people are really, well, there's a couple of reasons. I think, listen, when we talk about trauma is traumatic, right? Like people, by the definition, by the nature of it, we don't want to talk about it because we're worried that it's going to be painful or that it's scary or something. And it's weird because that's actually our natural inclination is actually the opposite of how we heal trauma, right? Like the way that we actually heal it is by understanding it, exploring it, talking about it. I have someone who's been a great mentor to me, Dr. Alicia Lieberman. She always talks about speaking the unspeakable, right? That's how we heal. And that's one of the really important things. But I think as a society, we've kind of all just somehow signed on to this this unspoken agreement that like, hey, we just don't talk about these things.
Right. Yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, I have obviously we're going to get into. I'm going to try not to turn this into a therapy session, but but somewhat disclose a little bit of the experiences that I had growing up. And I always tell people, like, for me, when I reference my childhood, when I reference, for example, my mother's childhood, I always have two different phrases when I address each one of them. So for my mother, I talk about my mother experienced trauma. When I talk about what I have gone through, I talk about that I've dealt with trauma. And for me, those are two very different things because I believe we naturally say, oh yeah, they dealt with it. They dealt with trauma. And it's like, well, what does the word dealt really mean? And so for me, I've spent time, diving into understanding why my behavior is today, why this triggers me, why do I follow the same pattern and end up with the same result. Luckily for me, I have a very influential individual in my life that caught me when I was very young and very fresh out of the military and said, hey, we got to start unpacking these layers, man. And it's not just physical, it's mental and emotional. And I was open to that because this individual allowed me to feel safe and that I could trust him. But then I started to feel like I can relate to him. But one of the things that he and I have discussed, because he too has experienced a lot of trauma, and that's where the connection came to be, is that, but he experienced, there was sexual abuse, there was physical abuse, there was verbal abuse, there was a lot of abuse in his home that him and his siblings experienced. And I know that as he got older, we've talked about, when parents now are passing, due to, just old age. And, he's talking about now certain feelings are starting to come up and they're triggered by all these different things. And I was like, well, what do you think how do you think you've dealt with that over the years? And he says, I realized that I just sort of just stored it away somewhere. I just kind of put it away somewhere else. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to, and it was just so fascinating because I'm like, wow, you would think something that shaped you, good or bad, indifferent, something that really affected you as a child would be something that would still surface every single day, but yet our bodies and our minds are so incredible in the way that in some way, shape, or form we can compress it and push it away and store it in some other space until something triggers it in its form of a key and unlocks it, and here comes that box with all our stuff exposed now. It's so fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, I think what we now understand is that a lot of that is for our survival, right? Like that's why we
Mm,
pack it away, is because if we had to expend the energy to be like in it every day, right? That is
mhm.
it's exhausting and it takes a toll on us. And
Yeah.
I want to, as you're talking about that, I want to like back up a little bit and uh, just say something a little bit about like what ACEs are. So when we talk about ACEs
Yeah. Yeah.
specifically, specifically the big research around this that really created, um, uh, what we now talk about as ACEs was this big research study from the CDC and Kaiser, where they looked at 17,500 people. And there they looked at 10 specific things, right? So they looked at physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical, emotional, or emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent had a chronic mental health condition, was substance dependent, where a parent was incarcerated, whether it's parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. So those were the 10 traditional ACEs. And what we now know is that when we experience these things, it actually activates our stress response, right? Like our body's fight or flight response. And when that gets activated too often or too frequently or intensely, and especially when that happens when we're kids, because children's brains and bodies are just developing, it can literally change the way our brains and bodies develop, right? So turns out all these stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, all this kind of stuff, they affect the way that our brains develop, the way that our immune system develops, the way our hormones develop, like all of these different things. And that was a lot of what I was seeing in my patients, where like, why did my kids who had a lot of trauma at home, why were they more likely to have asthma? Because of the effect on the immune system, right? Like, why were so many of them, being sent to me saying, hey, this kid has ADHD? It's like, well, for most of them, it wasn't actually ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It was that their stress response was overactive, right? And so what looked like not paying attention in class was actually really a difficulty focusing and paying attention, but it's because their stress response was activated, right? And so when you ask the question of, how is it that these things, as we go throughout life, right, they can affect us different ways, and as different things happen, we can get triggered. Part of the thing that happens when you have lots of adversity in childhood is that your stress response can become wired to be, one, more sensitive, right? And then two, have a difficult time turning itself off, right? Because yeah. So these are, and it's actually, so for anyone who's ever experienced this, it's literally like where people say like, oh, why are you, why do you get upset at this thing? Or why are you so triggered? Or why are you this? And it's literally like our body's stress response almost has like a thermostat where, it activates at a certain point and then we get more and more and more activated, then it turns itself off. And there's a normal kind of cycle in which that happens. So you can imagine if you change the settings on your brain and body stress thermostat so it gets activated more easily. That's very adaptive if you're growing up in a setting where scary things are happening all the time, right? Because as a kid, that kind of helps you get the help that you need, or respond to stressful situations. But then if you're trying to sit in a classroom and learn, that's no good. If you're an adult, you're trying to hold down a job, or you're trying to be in a marriage or a relationship and your partner is the one who's triggering you, then it's like, wait a minute, how come your stress thermostat is just getting turned on all the time? And why does it take so long to turn it off? Why is it so hard? And when you understand that, I think for a lot of people, just being able to understand, oh, you know what? I'm not crazy. It's actually the way that my body has adapted to the stress that I experienced in childhood.
Wow, that's so good. Can you elaborate on the harmful effects of toxic stress on health later in life? How it shows up? I mean, you talked about it as far as like a child, and start to understand, look, digging a little bit deeper and saying, oh, there's more to this than just what you're telling me and why you're bringing this child to me. But as this child now becomes an adult, how does this toxic stress ultimately show up in health later on in life?
So it's pretty profound. There's a lot of different ways. So I think some of the ways that we're generally most familiar with is that it can increase our risk for mental health and behavioral health conditions like depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidality, those things, as well as dependence on substances. So like definitely increased risk of dependence on alcohol, drugs, smoking, right? All of these things. And the more the higher your ACE score, right? The higher your risk of having these health conditions, these mental and behavioral health conditions. But the weird thing that I think a lot of people didn't know that we learned from the ACE research is that it also increases your risk for things like heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, chronic lung disease. And a lot of people just didn't know that information. Like they had never heard that before, and they didn't really understand why. But now that we understand how stress hormones affect the body in terms of affecting the brain, affecting the hormonal system, affecting the immune system, and it even affects the way our DNA is read and transcribed, right? So, so that is that's part of the reason why some of these effects are lifelong, and even can be handed down to the next generation, right? But the good news about this, right? So we now understand how it is that this can impact our health in adulthood. Because you can imagine if your stress response system, right? So toxic stress is this prolonged activation of the biological stress response. So if that's happening in your body and it's been happening since you were a kid, you can see why that might accelerate your risk of health conditions like, heart disease or depression. But what we now understand is that there's actually a lot of ways that we can actually help to regulate our stress response. And so this is the thing that is so exciting and fun for me about this work, because childhood adversity has been happening for, as I said in my book, since God was a boy, right? Like this for a really long time. But what hasn't, I think what this research and the science shows us is like, wow, there's so much that we can do. And it's stuff that we can do every day. And I think people just need to know about it. And it can really help people understand how to take this information into their own hands to improve their own health and well-being.
Yeah, to prevent it from being sort of this intergenerational transmission, right? Like, where it's not one of those things that is just continuously passed on and passed on and passed on. The more we're able to become aware of it, which is fascinating. You know, I had a guest on. He was a Vietnam veteran. He was a POW for 6.5 years. His name is Charlie Plum, and he said something that was, I mean, I remember hearing him on a friend of mine's podcast, and when I heard him and he said this thing, it pierced me, and it just sort of stopped me, and it really got me thinking. And it's one of those things that frequently pops up for me on a day-to-day basis, whether it's something that's, you know, I'm getting worked up over traffic, or I'm getting worked up sitting at an airport and there's a delay, or I'm getting worked up, you know, whatever it is, right? Silly things in the grand scheme of life. But he said, acid does more harm in the vessel where it's stored than on the subject where it's poured. And I remember,
Mm.
right? Right. And I just, every time, oh my God, when I heard that, I mean, I had that same reaction that you just had right now. And I think about that frequently. And so it's when you were just talking about it, it sort of, my mind immediately went to that of like, wow, you know, we think because we're conditioned it's better to keep it inside, yet the acid is essentially killing us and then making us more susceptible to all of these, you know, health, you know, conditions that surface later, right? And if we can just learn to which is then fascinating, because now it transitions to my next question where, you know, I know you I'm going to give you a second to sort of explain the number story .org, but I went to the number story, and it's a site where people can get your ACE score. And I can tell you, I went and I was like, I'm gonna check this out. I'm gonna read up on this, and then I was like, oh, there's the prompts to kind of take you through the process. So let me go through the process and see what my score is. I'm curious, and I went through the process. Now, at the conclusion, my score was a 7, and you know, naturally, without even knowing anything, my mind went to this place because, you know, when you go to the doctor, what does the doctor always ask you? What's your pain? What's your discomfort? 1 to 10, 0 being, you know, nothing at all, 10 being, oh my God, right? Like it's unbearable. And so naturally, I think I personally, I'm going to speak for myself. I'm conditioned that the higher the number, that's not good. And I see 7, and my mind immediately goes to sort of this defensive place where I was like, oh no, like I started trying to validate it. I started trying to like, well, I'm not that person anymore, and I've worked on this and I've done that. I mean, you know, and to me, it just speaks to what you were just talking about. Like, hey, it's okay. It's part of you understanding this is part of your journey, but this doesn't have to be the way your story ends. It's good to know it. Now, what do you do with it?
That's right. So that is the whole thing behind the number story campaign. And it really, number one, is to raise awareness and help people understand their ACEs and what it might mean for them. And then also the reason it's called number story is really to understand, like, what's the story of your number? Right. And how might it have affected you in the past? How might it be affecting you now? It's also a really great opportunity to have a conversation with your doctor, right? And say like, hey, what does this mean for me in terms of my health and all of that kind of stuff? But the cool thing about it is we get to determine where our story goes from here, right? And as someone who, you know, myself have experienced my fair share of ACEs, I think one of the things that was most powerful for me when I first read the ACEs research as a doctor, and I had never heard about it before, I literally was like, why have I never heard of this? Like, why is this not common knowledge? Why aren't people talking about this all the time? Because when we know better, we do better, right? And I will tell you, I have 4 kids, and I don't want, like, when I see situations, or let me, if there's one thing that our kids do, is our kids undoubtedly, like guaranteed, they're going to trigger us sometimes,
Yes.
right? Right. And so for me, I think it was really, really important for me to, as a mom, say, like, is this them or is this me? Like, am I
Yeah.
like because it's really important to remember that our fight or flight response was designed to, like, save our lives from a mortal threat, right?
Hmm.
So when we're in it, when we're activated, there's literally, like, our whole brain and body is wired to say, you've got to do something right now.
Yeah.
Right? And it takes a lot of work and practice and all kinds of, for some people it's therapy, for some people it's meditation, for some people it's yoga, for some people it's a workout, right? To
Yeah.
be able to get to the point where you start recognizing for your body, like, okay, wait a minute, I can feel myself being super activated. Now let me look at the situation. Is this actually a situation that requires a 10 out of 10 response?
Yeah.
Or is this maybe a 4 out of 10?
Yeah, that's so good. That's so true regarding parenting, right? You don't think about how all of that now spills over into different aspects of your life, personally and professionally. I mean, I have 2 kids. I mean, one of them's still a baby, so he's triggering me, but he ain't really doing anything. He's just being a baby right now, and then that's just like, what is it? But my 9-year-old, who is honestly an angel and just an incredible, kid. I mean, she will do things or say something, and I react a certain way. And I think because of the constant work that I've been mindful of doing and paying attention on my journey, I am now in that place where I can say, hold on, why am I reacting this way? Is it really about her? And my wife and I are so good about this. We'll come to our daughter and say, hey, listen, it's not you, it wasn't you. And our daughter now is starting to understand that, oh, so she's able to now apply this to her friends, to other people that she sees in school, to other people she sees in public spaces, family members. She's starting to have this understanding where she can develop compassion for somebody else because she knows it's probably, there's more. I mean, we saw this individual walking the other day. We were at the grocery store, and this young man's walking through the parking lot, and he just has some, some sort of interesting sort of, behavior movements, and she immediately is like, she's 9, so she's like, what's that about? And I said, well, you don't know if you don't know what's going on. You don't know what's just happened in his life. You don't know if he's diagnosed with something. You don't know. You just don't know. And I started to kind of throw out a lot of scenarios, right? I didn't want to just pinpoint one or two because that's obviously a mistake. I threw out a lot of different things that it could be just to get her
Yeah.
thinking. And I noticed that her demeanor shifted. Her demeanor completely shifted. She looked at that individual and she sort of just watched him as he was in the distance and he was by himself. He wasn't harming anybody, but you could tell there was, some activity. And she just sort of like looked at him with a different, sort of look in her eye. And I just thought to myself, that's what we're missing.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important as parents, as adults, to understand our own trauma, so that way we can then be better, show up to be better people for other individuals, right? And I think, yeah, I don't know. For me personally, I get into this whole thing of like thinking during this whole COVID, era, I believe that it was our opportunity to learn a lot about the things that we needed to pay attention to as individuals, so that we can collectively show up for one another in a better place from just a pure humanity, from a loving standpoint. And I believe that some of us have sort of missed that lesson. I think we haven't paid attention to what our number story is, right? What our ACE score is. But talk to me about, you mentioned about all these different things as far as like working out or meditation. I mean, can practicing mindfulness help protect our health? I guess that's the question.
Yes, yes, and yes.
I guess
No,
the answer is yes.
yes. So this is one of the really fun and cool things about being the Surgeon General for the state of California is that I get to read all of the research and really translate it into tools and materials that people can use to protect their health, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, for me, like this understanding the research about ACEs is as powerful as like, hey, smoking, causes cancer. Like understanding how our experience of ACEs, the activation of our stress response can impact our health, and then also what we can do about it. So one of the things that we know about mindfulness is that it helps to reduce stress hormones, reduce inflammation, which is a big part of it, and then also enhance what we call neuroplasticity, which is the ability of brain cells to make new connections, so that it enhances that. And that is exactly what we need to be able to heal from toxic stress. So that is a bunch of the stuff that you will see at numberstory.org is a lot of these resources and tools about mindfulness and mindful breathing and how to incorporate some of these evidence-based practices. Things like physical activity, right? Like getting out and getting that workout every day actually not only reduces stress hormones, but releases healthy hormones like endorphins and all this other stuff that actually combats the effect of stress hormones on our brain and body. And one of the most important things, like what you do for your daughter and in your relationship, and actually the safe, stable, and nurturing relationships, they actually release hormones in our bodies that help to shut off the stress response, right? And so you've probably seen this as a dad. Something scary happens with your daughter, right? Yeah. And what do? Your instinct, you wrap her up in a hug.
Yep.
You give her hugs, you give her kisses, and you say, you're okay, you're safe. And you let her know that she's safe, and you understand, you listen to what's going on with her. And when we do that, it actually helps to biologically shut off that stress response, right?
Wow.
It's very, very powerful. And in fact, I mentioned earlier that prolonged activation of the stress response can even affect the way our DNA is read and transcribed. But it turns out that those nurturing relationships, they also affect the way our DNA is read and transcribed.
Oh,
So
wow.
these interventions truly can be healing all the way down to our DNA. It's pretty amazing.
That I'm curious. So let's say, for example, because there's individuals that are listening right now or watching this and saying, well, I don't have any childhood trauma, right? I went to numberstory.org and my ACE score is incredibly low. It's not a 7 like JR's, like like mine's relatively low. It's a 1, it's a 2, maybe it's a 0. I don't know. Now you could probably argue that and say, well, let's really talk. Let's really start to unpack some stuff. Maybe there's some stuff you sort of stored away or you don't want to remember. However, there is a possibility where people's had a pretty, cozy and good childhood, and that's cool. How does this play in? Because I know it's called childhood trauma. How does it factor in if you now have an adult that okay, so let me reframe that question because I'm all over the place and my mind is sort of like racing because I love unpacking all of this. So I think of like military personnel, like I think of service members, and I think of there's some individuals that I have, including myself, that after something happens to them, after whether exposure to combat or whether they've been physically wounded, you start to see sort of a pattern of behavior, right? Part of that is, of course, your identity. You're trying to figure your new self out, the new world, and how to navigate it. However, I believe that for me, my injury was the trigger. This was the thing that essentially brought all of those ACEs to life, right? And
Yeah.
so I believe that there are a lot of individuals I'm not going to say all, but a lot of individuals that join the military, for example, to get away from a lot of the ACEs, a lot of that childhood trauma, using that as an escape. And literally, in the sense of from a distance perspective, get deployed or get stationed on the other side of the world. But what if there's a human being that says, listen, my childhood was pretty good, but now as an adult, I've been exposed to things in my 20s, in my 30s, in my 40s. Is there enough time to start to see, is there enough data that sees like, oh, well, this is also affecting you as well?
So first of all, I'm just going to say the question that you asked is so deep. I feel like maybe you've been reading all of the research, because there are a couple of pieces that I'm going to unpack. So
listen, I will come and work in your office for free as long as I can read all of this material, because it's so fascinating. And the thing is I'm addicted to this. I'm addicted to it in regards to my own journey, and I'm addicted to learning about this and about everybody else's journey. And I think that when you start to go down this road and you start to find there's a community and there's a safe space in the world for you to have this open conversation, I think you too find yourself going down this rabbit hole of like, oh, this is good, I want to learn more about this. And you start connecting dots. It's a puzzle. And I think it's fascinating. So I love it. I love this conversation.
So it turns out that the more ACEs that a person has, so the more likely they are to have, some of the different health conditions that I've talked about, physical health, mental and behavioral health conditions that I've talked about. But you also may have none of those, right? But what's interesting is that the more ACEs a person has, the more vulnerable they are or susceptible they are to having subsequent stressors then lead to a challenge. So, for example, we're seeing this right now with COVID-19. COVID-19 is a big stressor for all of us, right? And people who have experienced ACEs are more vulnerable to developing, and this is adults, right, to developing physical and mental health and behavioral health consequences as a result of this, like this hit, right? Like it's cumulative. So that's one of the pieces that's really, I think, important to know. And I think that's part of the reason why I've been talking about the importance of self-care and some of these evidence-based strategies to help to regulate our stress response, because we all need to be doing this, right? Because we're all going through a lot of stress, a lot of disconnection. We all are having our stress response activated by this pandemic, right? And it's the same thing. But literally what you were talking about, we actually looked at research that came out of the VA. And it turns out the more ACEs that a person has before going into the military, the more likely they are then to develop, when they come out, have developed these health consequences, right? So it turns out that, like, if you have higher ACEs and then you go into a situation that's super stressful, like war, right? You're more vulnerable to developing a negative outcome. Now, some people will have no ACEs, and then, war is about as stressful as it gets. So some people will have no ACEs, and then you'll go into that combat situation, because it's so well known. In fact, much of what we know about the impact of stress and trauma on the brain and body comes from research from in folks in combat, right? How much more likely they are to have, physical and mental health consequences. So I think that piece is really powerful. So I think that's something that we all need to understand, just knowing like, oh, hey, listen, I know I have a heart, I got a cardiovascular system, I know I got lungs, I got a respiratory system, I have a stress response system. How do I take care of that? Like we talk about eating for our heart, we know that we're not supposed to smoke to take care of our lungs. What are we doing to take care of our stress response? We all need to know that, right? And how do we recognize it if it's kind of getting overactive?
Yeah. You know, I've being of his, Latino, being a Latino, and I can tell you that in my culture, my mother's from Central America, El Salvador. My father's from Mexico. My father wasn't in the picture, so I always identify as Salvadorian because that's the side that I knew growing up. But I can tell you that something that I witnessed in my mother and I witnessed in other individuals that have the same culture, um, talking about stress, talking about trauma, being open about it is not something that, is highly promoted. In many cases, I saw my mother just pray it up, kiss it up to God, and just, hope that everything works out.
Yeah.
And, that she was very, very religious, very faith based in that sense. And, it's something that I watched as a kid, and I just thought to myself, was that how it works? And then of course, not to say that I don't believe in God and I don't have faith, and but I just started to realize, oh no, it's not that simple where you just throw it on someone else to take care of this. And over the years, I've started to, as much as we're getting into this conversation about social injustice and everything that has transpired in our country and in our world, but we're going to specifically focus on the United States. One of the things, and you start to see how, within the Black and brown, within Black, indigenous, people of color, those communities, how stress affects them. And I remember telling somebody one day, and this is purely just me, so this is not factual based at all, so I'm not pretending it is at all, that I didn't read something. But my thought is, well, if you think of our history, we haven't had the luxury to stop and to talk about our feelings and talk about our emotions.
Mm.
We've had to sort of, and I think of my mother, right? Whether you agree or not, my mother came here as an undocumented immigrant. I'm a proud son of an immigrant. She taught me so much. She encouraged me to give back to the United States of America to the point where I almost died for this country, right? That's what my mother instilled in me. And I can tell you that I witnessed in my mother coming here, being an undocumented immigrant, not knowing what tomorrow would look like as far as she was going to be here or be back in El Salvador. And she just oppressed every experience that she had, all the trauma she had. But I think the same is true for, people of color that are American citizens from the day that they're born. We're just taught, you don't have the luxury to talk about this. You have to show up and do more than your colleague that is not of color. And not to go into that deeply into that, but how have you seen that Black and brown people or indigenous people, how stress affects them, and how do we get our communities to be more open to this idea of saying, hey, it's okay, you're valid, it's valid, your feelings, it's valid, your experiences, but again, let's change the story.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, I'm also a proud immigrant. I came with my family from Jamaica when I was 4.5 years old. And let me just tell you, Jamaicans do not talk about this stuff. I will tell you that right now. And it is. Listen, I think one of the things that was really powerful for me is that, my dad is a biochemist, my mom is a nurse, so I grew up in a very scientific household. But my family's also super, 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 super Catholic. Like my dad, I was like, the Pope calls my dad for advice. Okay, and it's really funny because for me, that's actually, I think that was a huge gift that my dad gave me, because he gave me the gift of faith, but also the gift of science, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, we gonna put these two together and apply the science to do the healing work, right? Because this is something that is treatable. This is something that we can do something about. And I do think that one of the things that we've seen, because in the past, when there really was not a lot that we could do, like when we didn't understand this and didn't know the science and the evidence behind it, I think a lot of what we think of as culture, right, about how our people do things, right? So I spent a lot of time working with, caring for a lot of kids whose moms and grandmas or aunties and uncles were like, this was before I was married. Dr. Burke, like, this is just what we do. We lay hands on our kids, and that's how we guide them.
Yeah.
That's just what we do. This is our culture, right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, but now we have the science to know how this affects us. And the interesting thing about it, one thing I think is fascinating, is that, oftentimes the grandparent who used physical punishment on the now parent, now when they see the parent doing it to the child, they're like, oh, no, don't do that to the baby.
Yeah.
And you're like, wait a minute.
You taught me this.
Exactly. And what's powerful about it is I actually went down to Jamaica to talk about ACEs. Jamaica did a big, national campaign a couple of years ago. And they talked about the idea of having elders intervene to kind of rewrite the culture and talk about, how we can, and Jamaica is also a very religious country. They said, spare the rod and spare the child was what it was, just really, reframing some of that narrative. So I think that I think this is something that we have the opportunity to do. And I think that this is how we do this, right? We have these conversations in these spaces, and we make it okay for everyone, right?
Yeah.
For, Black, brown, whatever background, for folks to begin having this conversation. But the important thing about it, which is the thing that I think is so important about numberstory.org and all of the resources that are available, is that when we have these conversations, we also have to let people know that healing is possible and that we can connect to healing resources, right? And when we do that, that makes it easier and safer to begin having these conversations about, because it's really about, now that we know better, we can do better.
Yeah. September 10th is World Suicide Prevention Day. And I know that you spent that day visiting the Valley State Prison with your work with Compassion Prison Project. I want to know, like, what were some potentially takeaways from that visit? And what's fascinating to me is about a year ago, I had an opportunity to speak at a conference. It's this organization in San Diego, so in California. It's the Institute of Violence, Abuse, and Trauma, IVAT. Violence, yeah, and they bring in all these different organizations from around the world, and they have conversations, right, about how practices, things to do, how to help. And I met this individual who was attending the conference, and I didn't know it. I was in the lobby and started talking to him, and then we kind of moved to the outdoor bar, and we're sitting there watching, I think it was some sporting event on TV, and we started to have this conversation. I learned he's with the event, and he's a counselor, therapist. I forget exactly what his actual title is. But he starts sort of kind of asking me these questions and about my life, and I started asking him about his life, and I learned that where he lives, a lot of the work that he does, he goes into prisons, and he talks to these individuals that are, doing time for some pretty serious crimes, and he's sitting there learning about their childhood, their trauma, and first of all, I was like, that to me is so commendable and honorable, and I think it's a beautiful thing, despite what they have done, despite the pain that they have caused to, in other people's lives, yet to still think of them as a human being, and whatever time they have left on this earth, to give them some sort of peace. And he goes in and he talks to them. He learned that there was this pattern where, this guy that unfortunately, murdered someone, the woman that he was dating at the time, who had a son, when he went in to sit down and talk to him and started unpacking, he witnessed his own mother being murdered and it was just this, wow. It's like, how do you miss this stuff? There was a pattern there. What
So
was your visit like to the prison?
it was really intense. I will tell you, I heard that story over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
The number of people who told me that they witnessed their one gentleman said he witnessed his father kill his mother in front of him, right? Stuff that for like it's I can't even fathom.
Yeah.
And it was just over and over and over again. And what what the research, the national research shows that over 95% of people in our prisons have experienced at least one ACE, and half have experienced 4 or more ACEs, more than half. And what we recognize is that when people have experienced intense childhood trauma, if we don't recognize it and do the early work to do early intervention, right?
Mhm.
We just end up paying so much more later on down the line. And
Yeah.
one of the incarcerated residents said to me, and he was there for life. So I don't know what he did, but a life sentence, it's
Yeah,
gotta be
that's a
something
serious.
for
Yeah.
us. That's right. And he said to me, he said, I just have to let you know that this program, and he said the Compassion Prison Project, where they teach incarcerated residents about ACEs, about breaking the cycle. And one thing people forget is that a lot of this was a prison where it was all men, but a lot of these men are still head of household, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
They are still the man of the family, and they're talking to
Yeah.
their families every week, and they have an important role to play in preventing this trauma from being handed down to the next generation and the next generation. And what one gentleman said to me, he said, this program is preventing so many rapes and murders because when we finally understand what is going on with us, he says, I want to heal. I don't want to be out there hurting people.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to
Yeah.
heal. And you know what? I want to heal my family,
Yeah.
right?
And
And
then
I
and then you start to break the patterns of whoever
yeah,
they're speaking to at home, sons, nephews,
yes, that's
cousins, someone that looked up to them in the community, whatever. Now you're starting to like pass this down and you're hoping preventing them from following the same path. So that way the story isn't, oh, I see my relative now on the other side of the prison, right? Like
that's right.
that's what we're trying to get to. So listen, you are a busy woman. You are doing so much. You are but I tell you, probably the busiest title you can have, and you alluded to this earlier, is being a mother of 4, but not just of 4 boys. What is that like? I'm sure those boys keep you busy.
Well, I will tell you, the backstory on the mother of 4 boys bit is that I am a sister to 4 brothers. So my parents had 5 kids and I was the only girl. And so I feel like it's a little bit, it's my lot.
Trained.
I feel prepared. Like
You are trained.
I, I spend a lot of time, putting down toilet seats. No, 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 not putting down, teaching, walking, saying, hey, what's going on over here? Come on. But you know what's really fun? I have to say, I love being a mother of boys. I just love it. They're so beautiful to give them the opportunity to be vulnerable, to give them the
Mhm.
opportunity to express themselves in any which way. I don't get anyone to go with me to the nail salon to get my I tried that. I'm like, hey, maybe you just want like a buff or something. No one will go with me. That's okay.
Meanwhile, every other mother right now is listening to this and saying, "But Dr. Harris, wouldn't you just enjoy that time by yourself and be glad that you have no one to go with you?" But you still want to have, one of your kids with you.
Yeah. My
Yeah, I
husband
get
does
it.
a lot of, all of the things that my husband loves doing, he gets a lot of takers, right? The things that I love doing, I don't get a lot of takers. But that's okay, because I will tell you the thing, and I also have a 9-year-old. The thing that the place where I got to win was I'm a crazy Star Wars fan. And I introduced our kids to Star Wars, and that's the bonding moment we have.
Oh my God. You
Yeah.
and my wife. My wife grew up on Star Wars. I mean, is hardcore about it. I'm surprised she didn't name our son one of the characters from,
Yes.
Star Wars. I'm surprised she drew the line there. What would you say? Because we have a boy in the house, right? He's a couple months old now.
Mhm.
What is something that we should pay attention to? Because one of the things that I noticed when my daughter was born and we were in the hospital, I was sitting there holding her. I was like, I love you. I'm going to love you. I'm going to protect you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm saying all of those things. Yet
Mhm.
my son, I'm in the hospital. And we're like, I'm going to teach you how to take care of your mom and your sister. I'm going to teach you how to love them. And I caught
Mm.
myself and I'm like, wait a minute. The work that I do with an organization called A Call to Men would tell me, hey, no, you can say the same thing you said to your daughter
Yeah.
because manhood should look very different, right? And so then now I'm like, it's okay, man. It's all right. I love you. I'm here for you. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be like my
Yeah.
language shifted a little bit, but what is something that we should expect from, having a boy in the house?
Whew. Well, I would say that every child is their own person. There
Mhm.
is no way. I think that sometimes we have this idea that girls are a certain way, boys are a certain way, and I have a lot of girlfriends who have girls, and there's some things that are kind of common. But
Yeah.
what I would say is that seriously, what you just described in terms of that awareness of how we talk to our boys, or how we talk to our kids, just the expectations, our internalized expectations that we have
Mhm.
for them, and letting them feel safe to be whatever it is that they decide that they want to be, right? That
Yeah.
is, I think, the big takeaway for there's no space.
Love it.
The funny thing is, our 4 boys are so different. Like every single one, you're like, huh, didn't expect that one to go that way, but okay. you know, and you just try to love and encourage them and let them know that they're safe and that they're okay. And that's
Awesome.
it. Yeah.
So, all right, before I let you go, Dr. Harris, again, I want to be respectful of your time. I appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast. So, what is the best call to action to everyone listening and watching right now to teach others about ACEs and sort of the campaign and all the resources that are available to them in order to be able to heal?
Yeah. I would say one of the most important things that I talk about is that self-care isn't selfish. We have to put
Mm,
our own oxygen masks on so that we can be available to be supportive to others. And so when we are talking about learning about ACEs and toxic stress, getting the information and sharing the information with others, uh, I think that one of the most important things is that we just start with ourselves. And that's one of the things that I think is so powerful about numberstory.org, is that it helps us begin that individual journey and figure out, okay, how is this showing up for me? And even if for someone who has 0 ACEs, right, who has
yep.
no ACEs, how how can I use this information to navigate work situations
Yeah.
with other people, or my
Yeah.
relationships, or people in my life that I love and care about, because or even maybe you don't have anything that's on the 10 traditional ACEs when you go to Number Story and do the, walk through the test, but maybe there's something else in your life that might be the thing that you need to work on healing. So I think that is the place that I would always start. Always starts with kind of loving and nurturing ourselves. And then that gives us the power and the energy to be able to show up for other people.
Well, I'll be sure to put it in the show notes so people can click on the link and go and do their little, self-assessment test and better learn and better understand. How can people stay in touch with you, Dr. Harris? Follow all of the incredible things that you and your team are up to and what you're rolling out. I mean, how can people find you? Is there a social site? Is there?
Absolutely. So it's Twitter at Dr. Burke Harris. Oh, Twitter and Instagram, Dr. Burke Harris.
Okay.
And there's also Number Story is my Number Story on Twitter and Instagram as well. They can also follow the Office of the California Surgeon General, which is CAOSG on Twitter and Instagram as well. So yeah, stay in touch.
I'm gonna hit that blue button. I'm gonna give you a follow. I want to stay in touch. I want to continue to learn about all the incredible things that you're doing. And of course, if you come across an article and you're like, who else can I share this with?
All right.
Me. I'll take it. Dr. Harris, thank you so much for the time. You've been a joy to talk to. I appreciate all of your work. I appreciate you rolling out, ACEs and sort of paying attention to the pattern that was, existed in your office within the patients, and not just saying, hey, I'm going to prescribe something, deal with it. Okay, next case. Instead of looking at them as a number, looking at them as a human being and as a person. And I respect you and I appreciate you for diving in and doing that work. And now being an example, because I read an article in the Washington Post that now you're training, you set a goal to train 20,000 physicians in the state of California with regards to ACE. And so you're doing a lot of work and you're not just keeping it to yourself, you're now rolling it out to everybody else. So I appreciate you. If there's anything I can ever do to help you, you have a friend here and I'm more than happy to help in any way that I can.
Oh, thank you so much. The pleasure has absolutely been mine. This has been a great conversation. Thank you.